TFD Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Sullivan, and this is the show where we break down popular science into easily digestible and actionable information to give you the blueprint to be a high performer in your life. Today, I'm joined by TFD Performance Dietitian Ryan Hasell, and we are talking about calories. More specifically, we're going to talk about the different components of calories out and talk about how to work out your own caloric needs. We discuss the importance of understanding that there is always a margin of error, the benefits of working with a professional, and how to use smart devices as guidance tools. Let's get to it. All right, welcome to another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. We are back and rolling strong with these since our little trips away. We were away for about 3 months, so we've got a lot of time to make up. But I'm joined by TFD Performance Dietitian Ryan the Mullet Hasell. Dojo, how you doing?
Good, thanks, Jordy. Good to be back.
How's the mustache? How's the mullet?
Look, I'll probably need a trim on the mullet. It's getting a bit rowdy, but we'll sort that out next week.
Me and Dojo, when we were in Utah for our last fight week, went and got a haircut the day of fight day. And I'm very particular with how I get my haircut. And it took a while. It took like an hour and a half. And Dojo just got his mullet maintained and a few clips. And it took
just the sides.
It was just as long and it was ridiculous. But anyway, for today's podcast, I want to do this podcast about this topic because when I did my Q&A last week, I got literally about 100 questions about this. The question was simply, how do I work out how many calories I need? And as simple as a question that seems, when you break it down and you try to put that into real world practice and you try to apply that to yourself, it's quite difficult. And if you need evidence that it's difficult, you just need to look around. And if it was so easy, we wouldn't have people struggling with their weight. We wouldn't have people not knowing what to eat. We wouldn't have people not knowing how to fuel their sessions. It's a lot harder than what it would seem. So that's what me and Dojo are going to break down. We're going to go over what calories are, what our experience with predicting them are, and how we put all this to practice in our real world practice. So let's get started. I think, Dojo, let's just get an intro. The first thing that I want to go over is the first thing people usually talk about when we talk about calories is calories in, calories out. And yeah, you can have a whole discussion. To have this discussion, you need to understand what calories in and calories out are. First and foremost, let's break down those different components.
Right. So, let's talk about calories. Calories out is kind of like the main important one here when we're kind of trying to figure out how many calories we need, because we kind of need to replace the calories that we're putting out. So when it comes to our calories out, we kind of use this umbrella term of there's a few different ones that get thrown around, but the main one would be total daily energy expenditure, or TDEE. And within that, there's four main components four main ways that our body burns calories. So you might have heard of some of these before, some of them you might not have, but it's important to kind of understand where they fit into the picture and how they affect the amount of calories that you burn. So the first one we've got is RMR. Well, I'll just rattle through them quickly and then we can kind of go in deep on each one. So we've got RMR, the thermic effect of food, physical activity, and then non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which sounds a bit hectic, but we'll get to that in a second. So the first one is RMR, right? So RMR stands for resting metabolic rate, which is just all of the calories that we burn up during the day, doing basically everything that goes on within your body that you don't really control. So things like your heart pumping, your breathing, all the different chemical reactions and stuff that are going on inside of you, all of that takes energy, right? So all of that combined makes up what we call our resting metabolic rate. Now, this is actually a pretty big chunk of that total daily energy expenditure. And our RMR can actually account for up to 60 to 70% of our total energy output during the day. The next one is the thermic effect of food. Now, this one's a bit counterintuitive, right? We think we eat food, we get energy in, but it actually takes a bit of energy in order to process that food. So when we take food in, it needs to be broken down into smaller parts. It needs to be absorbed. It needs to be transported around the body. And then when it gets to where it needs to go, then it needs to also be processed. And there's a lot of metabolic processes and stuff involved in that as well. So all of that takes energy. Now, it's not a big chunk of energy, and there's no foods where you're going to be putting yourself in a negative energy balance just by eating them. But it is important to keep in mind that those processes do take up some energy as well. And that'll account for somewhere roughly like 10%. There's like, depending on person to person and like depending on the types of foods you're eating, it can be anywhere like 8 to 15-ish%. So it's only a small part of the energy going out during the day, but it does play a role. The next one is physical activity. This one's a bit of like a no-brainer, right? Like when you exercise, you use your muscles, they use up energy. Like everyone knows that, right? But what I think is important to kind of like highlight with physical activity is it's not actually as big a chunk of your total energy expenditure as what people might think, right? So this is, I think, where a lot of people get stuck trying to like, balance out an unhealthy diet with exercising heaps in order to compensate. Realistically, physical activity, even like planned physical activity, really only makes up for the average person around 15 to 30% of their total energy output. So it's really not a big chunk at all. And it's not a big chunk at all. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're thinking about trying to like run off a Mars bar or something, right? Like it's important to get the diet right and get the exercise right if you're trying to like do things like lose or gain weight or maintain weight through that calories in, calories out thing that we were talking about earlier. So rather than just focusing on physical activity. The last one is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This one is, I should say before I jump onto this one, physical activity is only around 15 to 30% of our total daily energy expenditure. So if you think about it, it's like half of what we would burn just with our resting metabolic rate. So to get onto the fourth one, the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, it's a big word. Usually we just refer to it as NEAT, makes it a bit simpler. This is the energy we burn up during the day, doing like unplanned physical activity through little like day-to-day tasks, right? So, things like chores or like gardening, walking around the house, anything that's like not actually structured exercise, but it's going to require some energy to do, that would be considered NEAT or like non-exercise activity thermogenesis. But this also only makes up a small portion of our energy out. Did you have any questions about any of that, Jordy?
No, I think something that I like to really highlight, like you said, is the exercise. And I think that people always come to me and they say, I'm exercising heaps and I'm still not losing weight. And it's like, yeah, but it's just one component of it, right? And it's such a small component. One thing that I do want to touch on just before we go any further is what a calorie actually is. And I think this tripped me up a lot. I remember being in undergraduate and learning about this for the first time. And then kind of the first time I wrapped my head around what a calorie was describing, I was like, okay, this makes a lot more sense. Because I think calories get this bad reputation, or like people have this idea that they're inherently bad for whatever reason, or they are something. And all a calorie is we're just using that as an expression to describe energy. Like it's a way we describe energy in the body. So it's a unit description of energy. So how we describe it, it's basically describing how our body takes chemicals from food and then goes through our metabolic process and then produces units of energy that we can actually use for different metabolic functions. And so like when people are always talking about, I've got good calories, bad calories, blah, blah, blah. You're like, what are you talking about? Like a calorie is just a unit of energy. That's what we're using to describe. It's not anything. It's just what our body is producing. So I think that's important to understand. And I think understanding, yes, calories in is the food that we're getting, and all those calories in are when we eat that food, we break down the different components of that food, we break down the bonds that fuels these metabolic processes that give us energy. And then how we balance that out is with our calories out. So we're going to have a baseline calories out with our RMR, our resting metabolic rate, which is the energy that we need to keep all of our body's organs and everything going if we were just to lay in bed and look at the ceiling all day and do absolutely nothing. But no human does that. So you get up, you're going to eat food, you're going to use energy to digest that food to then further break it down and get more energy. You're then going to get up, and a lot of people listening to this are going to be training 1, 2, 3 times a day. You're going to be burning energy during that. And you're also going to be up and doing all these other weird things, like me moving my hands around, you getting up and getting coffee, going to the bathroom, going up and down stairs. All of that requires energy. And I think breaking down this and explaining it and then having a better understanding of energy gives you this aha moment of, oh, this is what people mean when it's not that simple. Because really, when you boil it down and you crank it down and you look at the laws of thermodynamics, it is that simple in the sense that calories in does equals calories out. If you want to lose weight, you need more output than what you're having input, and vice versa. If you want to put on weight, it is that simple. If you were to break down the maths, where it gets very complicated is trying to define what those numbers are. Because defining these numbers, it's not like we can just go pluck calories in and we have some fancy testing that we can go off and send people to do. Even then, we're still trying to measure a unit of energy, of this description of energy. It's very, very difficult to get this in. And I think that's a good segue going into our next part is, well, if we can't measure it and it's very, very difficult, what's the best way to go about it then?
For sure. And just like quickly before we segue into that, it's probably really good to touch on as well that like of those 4 parts that make up our energy out, only really 2 of them we can even influence. Like the resting metabolic rate is pretty much like it's individual. Like everyone's resting metabolic rate would be different depending on like age, gender, like genetics, all that sort of stuff. But for that person, it's going to be pretty stable, like for most of their life. And even the thermic effect of food, like that doesn't really change much unless your whole diet like completely changes. For most people, that's going to be pretty similar. So really the only way we can influence the energy out is through changing our physical activity levels. Now, when it comes to figuring out our energy requirements, as you're kind of getting to there are a couple of different methods that we can use. Probably the most accurate one that we have access to at the moment is something that we call indirect calorimetry. Sorry about that, indirect calorimetry. So this is basically a measure. So they'll hook you up to a machine, some sort of a mask on your face, or sometimes they have like those, I don't know if you've seen the old like divers, like the full head suit thing. Basically what that does is just to measure your breath. So from your breath, they'll be measuring things like carbon dioxide production, oxygen. These are things that when we burn up calories in our body, we're basically doing combustion, right? So we're producing carbon dioxide, there's oxygen, all these gases are being passed in and out of our lungs. And what the machine does is measures the amount of those gases that are coming in and out and uses predictive equations based on that information to figure out how much energy you're burning at any given time. Now, there's a couple limitations to that, which we'll get to in a minute, but that's basically the gold standard of what we have at the moment for predicting your, and like what that will tell us is your resting metabolic rate. It's very difficult to use indirect calorimetry with someone who's moving or doing anything. So it's kind of hard to get the full picture, but what we can kind of measure with that is like what your resting metabolic rate is. Now, some other methods that we can use and that are pretty commonly used because they're a bit easier, like cheaper, easier to access, are things like predictive equations. So there's a couple that get thrown around. These equations will basically take into account a person's body weight, maybe their lean mass, maybe their total body mass, maybe their age, maybe not, maybe their activity levels. There's all sorts of factors that can play in. And there's lots of different equations that exist that try to predict someone's total like metabolic rate the most accurately. The problem is there's like so many and they all have different applications. For example, there's ones that are more suited for different populations, right? So you've got average humans and then you've got these like freak people that are athletes. Their metabolic rates are going to be different based on different factors. And so equations like the Cunningham equation might be better for athletes, where the Harris-Benedict or something like that might be better for like Gen Pop people. But in saying that, it's like, it's a predictor. So that's all it is it's like an estimation of where your energy expenditure might be. But it's very rare, and there's a lot of studies on this, that it's very rare that it will be like completely accurate. Which I think is a good thing to kind of touch on here, is like, if these measures, even the calorimetry is still based on equations, right? Like they get all the information from the gas exchange, but then that still has to go through predictive equations to figure out your resting metabolic rate. So if we have like all this room for error and there's like very little actual accuracy to this, like where does that leave us in like a practical sense? Like how do we use this information in real life in order to, like estimate how much food someone needs to eat in order to lose weight or gain weight or improve their performance. What would you say the best like way to navigate this is?
Yeah, it's a really good talking point, because this in lies, I think, one of the biggest and most confusing problems in nutrition. And I know a lot of people, when you start talking about this, I'm sure you've heard this debate where they're like, oh, calories doesn't matter. It doesn't matter about calories. Just eat good and get your hormones right. It's like, no, that violates the fundamental principles of thermodynamics, which describe the universe. And it applies to every single thing in the universe. And calories exist in the universe, so they have to abide by these rules. Calories do exist, and calories in, calories out are absolutely a thing. It is extremely frustrating, though, because you're left in this position because you're like, well, even if I get this really fancy breath test and you're telling me I do this gas exchange, it's still got to go through these population-based equations, and there will still be a margin of error for me. And I think what's important and what you need to appreciate is that everything in nutrition science comes with a margin of error. And what you're trying to do as a practitioner or as a person that's trying to improve their weight and improve their performance or whatever, and you're trying to calculate your calories, you're trying to do as many things as possible to close that margin of error for your particular body. And this is something that me and Ryan were just talking about when we talk about, say, experienced practitioners, where I've seen thousands of different athletes, and let's say athletes in a very particular sport in MMA. So I've seen thousands of different athletes in MMA. So I've banked up all this experience and all of these RMR tests and all of these predictive equations outcomes for this very particular population. So all of a sudden, my margin of error for this population is probably going to be much smaller because I have way more data, and I'm not just relying on these population-based studies that have just pulled Jill and Johnny and Timmy off the street and got this average from all these random people. So as a practitioner, it's far easier to get a more dialed in calorie prediction when you've worked with that population for a long time. But then people are sitting here listening to this and going, oh yeah, cool for you, TFD. You've worked that and you get, but what about for me sitting at home listening to that? And this is where it kind of sucks. This is where it kind of sucks, because at the end of the day, there's nothing more I can tell you than you either do the predictive equation, you just work it out by hand, accept the larger margin of error, or you go get one of these more fancier tests like a RMR test, and you close that margin of error, but you still appreciate that that margin of error is there. And when you go and put this into practice, you have to appreciate the margin of error. So when I say to Dojo, hey, Dojo, your RMR has been 2,000 calories, in reality, when you work out all the numbers and you get your maintenance and it works out to be 2,200 or whatever, it may end up being 2,400. It may end up being 1,800. But the fact of the matter is you won't know until you go and try it, and you have to test and see in the real world what that margin of error is.
Yeah. And I think this is probably like another, you kind of like touched on it there as well. It's like when we have been working with like this many athletes over this amount of time, I guess it accumulates like a certain level of like practitioner, I guess just like understanding, or like you at least for me, I'm sure you definitely have this to probably a lot more specific degree than what I have at this stage, but like you kind of start to see these patterns emerge of like people who there might be like a similar activity level, similar sport, similar body size even, and you start to see these patterns emerge where people might their like calorie requirements based on a calculation might be X, but then you kind of know, okay, well, this person, maybe they're doing like 3 days or whatever, doing like wrestling. And we know that wrestling is probably going to be like higher energy expenditure. They're going to need more. And you start to see consistencies in how much they might need to be taking in order to like, maintain their weight or like maintain their energy levels at training. So I think this is something that's really important, and kind of speaks to the importance of working with a practitioner. Like, of course, you can look up, there's like all of these equations are available online. There's even like websites you can go to just type in and get like a calorie requirement based on like your age, weight, height, whatever, something like that. But that's kind of like the beauty of working with someone with experience in the field, is they're going to be able to bridge that gap that you were talking about between like the rough estimate and what is actually going to work for you as a athlete or business person or whatever. I think that's kind of like an important part of where we fit into.
Yeah. And that's the most important thing when I talk to clients, right? Like I think in what we do, especially when we're talking about combat athletes, if we talk about all the other athletes, probably not as important, but when you're a combat athlete and someone says you got 8 weeks to make this weight, you got to lose X amount of weight, you don't really have the time to play around with that margin of error. Like everyday people like you and me, Doge, we go, hey, in 4 months or something, we want to be this weight. We can kind of spend 4 weeks just playing around, dilly-daffing around these different calories until we find something that we hit the amount that we want to lose each week. We still feel good. We can still train and we're hitting that percent body weight loss each week. We can spend 4 or 6 weeks kind of playing around and getting that. When you've got an athlete that says, hey, I've got to make weight in 8 weeks, boom, you don't have that time to mess around with it, especially if you've never worked with them before. That's where it's so important to go back on this bank of information, especially we're so lucky that we've got a huge, vast amount of experience and information on all these athletes that we can, like you said, look at someone and say, hey, look, you're similar body composition, similar shape, your training schedule is very similar to this, the intensity and the way your training schedule is structured is very similar to this. From my experience, when I think about all of the things that contribute to your calories out and what we can control and what we can't control, I think you will need X amount of calories to achieve Y amount of weight loss over Z amount of time. And that's essentially what you're paying for. It's like the efficiency. But for everyday people, the fact of the matter is, and the reality is you're probably going to have to spend a bit of time figuring out, okay, well, what is my real calorie requirements and how do I go about doing things to close this margin of error so I can get these numbers perfect for me. And I think one last thing that I probably do want to say, because everyone kind of asks me this, is, well, what happens when I get those numbers? And the reality of this situation is you're probably never going to get those numbers because your metabolism, as much as we like to think of it as like a static thing, it's a very dynamic system. If I get up off this chair and do 20 burpees randomly in the middle of this podcast, my metabolism has technically changed and my output for the day, although slight, has changed. So things that we do and how our lives change. And this is why we always promote if you're trying to do a weight loss phase, weight gain phase, or manage your weight in any way, performance nutrition, even when we're trying to work out these calories, staying consistent throughout your day, having consistent training, having consistent sleep, being consistent with your intake, your fluid intake, so we can control as many of these calories in and calories out factors. So we can start to find, okay, where is your maintenance zone of calories? Where is your weight loss zone of calories, your surplus zone of calories? And we can start banking this information. And I encourage everyone, if you're at home listening to this going, where do I start? Start doing that. And the easiest way is do one of these predictive equations, appreciate you've got this margin of error, and then control for as many factors as you can, make them consistent over a period of time. And then you just have to go out and give it a go. You have to give it a go and see how your body responds. And is it that you're hitting your weight loss, or is it feeling good? Define your goals and then see how you hit them and adjust each week with how you go.
That's completely right. Like you just, without having the knowledge, you kind of just got to use a bit of trial and error, which, as you said, is probably fine for most people. But if you're on a time crunch and you've got time restraints for needing to be a certain weight or get somewhere, I would definitely recommend hitting up a trained professional.
Very last thing that we want to talk about, because a lot of people ask this, they go, oh, I've got a smartwatch, or I've got an Apple Watch and I've got this and it tells me all this. I think, again, you need to appreciate they're just using the exact same systems that have the same margin of error. So when you're walking, they're just trying to take whatever factors you're punching into that equation and then spit some numbers out to you. So there's the same amount of margin of error on all of those things as if you just went to Google and punched in something or spoke to someone else. So what you need to keep in mind with these smartwatches and smart devices is that take it with a grain of salt. Maybe they are a tool that you can use to help decrease that marginal error, or it's a tool that you can use to keep something consistent as you're trying to do other things to decrease that marginal error, such as, okay, I'm going to hit 10,000 steps every day. I'm going to use my watch to track that, or I'm going to use my smartphone to track my calorie intake so I can keep that consistent during this trial period. So in that sense, they're really good, but you need to be mindful that, yes, they use all the same equations, have the same margin of error as everything else.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, they're all just tools in the whole process, right? And there's a lot of different ones that can be used in order to make things as accurate as possible. But yeah, at the end of the day, there's no like one single perfect measure that we're going to be able to use, right?
Yeah, exactly right. I think that's us for time. Dojo, do you have any last closing thoughts about calories out?
No, I think that covers everything. We could potentially do something about calories in at some stage, or like how the whole equation fits together, but I think that's good.
Yeah, I think important things to understand here is that calories, it's just a unit of measure of energy. It isn't anything that has any inherent qualities about it. I think being mindful of what calories out really is, understanding what your RMR is, the thermic effect of food, physical activity, and what your NEAT is. I think really appreciating that physical activity doesn't contribute as much as what you think to your overall calories out is really important. And that old saying of you can't outwork a bad diet is largely true because of that. And then being mindful, like, yes, you've got to get these equations. Yes, you've got to get these numbers. Be mindful there's going to be a margin of error, and you're probably going to have to spend a good deal of time, trial and error, to figure out what's going to work for you. End of the day, like everything, good things take time. So spend the time, keep as many factors consistent as you can, and just spend some time learning about your body and learning what works for you.
Yeah.
All right, Doge, I think we'll wrap that up there, and until next time.
Easy.